Okay, this morning we are engaging in part number 5 of this subsection of our Ologies series. Lord willing, next Sunday will be part number 6, so the last of my little subsection of our Ology series, after which we will turn it over to Mr. Matt Shively, who is going to be taking us through ecclesiology, and then however long that takes, and then we have eschatology. So we're nearing the end of this systematic theology series, and hopefully you've gleaned much from it. Hopefully you've been able to find a lot that perhaps maybe you haven't thought a lot before, but maybe even more so maybe things that you have thought about before, but they're kind of coalescing, they're kind of coming together for you in a way as you read the scriptures and putting all of the different doctrinal pieces together. Again, all of this is stirring us, hopefully it's stirring you to be good students of the Word. This is really just a launching off point. Each of these series that we've gone through, the sub-series of the different doctrines, you could spend a lot more time. We're only spending 6 weeks on roughly these 3 topics, anthropology, hamartiology, and soteriology. And I'm already preparing you. I will probably do a disservice to the doctrine of salvation because we could spend a long time talking about everything that's involved in that. So all of this is just to say these are like bird's eye flyovers, and what you have in front of you, the Word of God, is where you can really nail down, dig down, and get really a lot deeper. So hopefully this is stirring you to do that. That's really kind of my goal. Regardless, last week we ended on a fairly sour note. We've been talking about hamartiology, the doctrine of sin, where it comes from, and all those sorts of things. And we spent a lot of time last week engaging with Genesis chapter 3. And we left off with Adam and Eve as they plunged the world into sin, as they, the very familiar story. They believed in the lie of the serpent. They ate of the fruit that they were not supposed to eat of, and they believed that they could be their own God. We were examining Genesis 3 from this perspective of how sin came into the world, and basically how sin came into the world. It infiltrated through the deception of Satan, in which now mankind, Adam and Eve, were questioning that this world that God had given them, that God had called very good, wasn't in fact very good. And in fact, they could make their own goodness, and that's what we've spent a lot of time talking about. We saw that there were a lot of terms for sin. We flew over a couple of these, but some terms for sin that appear in Scripture are terms like transgression, or rebellion, or lawlessness, or ungodliness, or iniquity. The most common, of course, comes from the book of Romans, where Paul says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." This word sinned is where we get the word hamartiologies, hamartia in Greek, or chata in Hebrew, and this appears over and over and over again throughout both Testaments, Old and New. Does anyone remember the sort of short definition of what this word means? No, everyone fails the pop quiz. No. If you remember archery, you would know that it means missing the mark. Essentially, that's what this word means. You're missing the mark of what God has laid down, His standard, and you're missing it through choices, through actions. And so we spent a lot of time exploring that. We also just made this sort of summary statement because if you're missing the mark, you're failing to live within the standard of goodness that God has laid down, that God has ordained. We can think about it this way. Sin is blatant distrust of God, which leads to obedience. And this is sort of the whole way we can understand Genesis 3. The serpent got Eve to distrust what God had said was very good, so it's distrust that leads to disobedience that then, of course, leads to death. This is very clear, Genesis 3:6. "So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate." And this is, again, that moment where sin infiltrated the world. And again, we mentioned this last time, but just to reemphasize too, this is Genesis 3:6, you could kind of draw a parallel to 1 John 2:16, which is where the Apostle John says, "For all that is in the world, the desire of the flesh and the desire of the eyes and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world." All of that is a really good way of understanding sin and understanding that initial moment when sin infiltrated the world through Eve's deception, through believing in the lie. But again, as we saw last time, they chose. They chose to distrust, and then that led to disobedience. They chose to trust actually more in the serpent's words more than in their creator's. And again, the gist of Satan's lie was that the creator, God the creator, didn't really have their best interest at heart. He actually wasn't good. He was more like a tyrant. He was more like a miser. And he was keeping something. The tree was representative of something that he was holding back from them. He was keeping something from them that they should enjoy. And they failed the test, so to speak, because they believed in the lie that they could make their own shalom. They could make their own peace. They could make their own fulfillment. That they could complete themselves, because actually they're not complete right now. Actually, there's something missing. And that the Creator is holding something back from them. And instead of finding their glory in what God has given them, the gifts that God had given them for free, and finding their happiness there and finding their fulfillment in God himself, sin, we could really understand it as the rebellious choice to pursue our own glory. Because that's essentially what has happened in Genesis 3. They're pursuing their own glory. And we left off, or here's a quick summary of much of what we went through. Sin isn't doing just bad things. It's an attempt, foolish, yes, but it's an attempt to be like God. And we noted at the very end that it's a reversal of creation. This comes from Jeremiah 4:22 through 23, where the prophet Jeremiah is talking about the state of the world in which he is living. And remember, most of Jeremiah occurs either on the brink of exile or in the midst of exile. Notice what he says: "For my people are foolish, they know me not. They are stupid children. They have no understanding. They are wise, but only in doing evil. But how to do good they know not." Which, of course, is a really good way of understanding sin. It's just a really long definition of it. "I looked on the earth, and behold, it was without form and void, and out into the heavens, and they had no light." Sin brings darkness. It fractures creation. It breaks what God has designed to function. He's designed us to function within the standard of goodness, that he is God. It goes back to that concept of we are image bearers, right? That we are ones who bear the image of our Creator, and we are created for a purpose that now is broken. You could also relate Jeremiah 4:22 and 23 to Isaiah 29:16, which we've spent a lot of time about the potter and the clay. But notice that first phrase: "You turn things upside down." Sin is really turning things upside down. It's this preposterous idea of the clay trying to resist its potter's will and wisdom and ways in which he wants that potter to work and to function. And that's, again, how we ought to see sin in the world and in our lives. Sin is image bearers outright denying the one who created them, one who fashioned them. And again, it sounds insane. It kind of sounds ludicrous, but that's really indeed how deranged sin is. It turns things upside down. If you're in Genesis, I hope you're still in Genesis 3, because I'm going to look at a couple of verses and then really explore more in Genesis 3 and then also Romans chapter 5. Because the point this morning that we have to understand is that, of course, sin must be judged. We see this right away. The effects of sin are felt. Adam and Eve feel shame. They try to clothe themselves. They try to cover up everything that they did that was wrong. They try to cover up themselves by sewing fig leaves together and whatnot. But then, of course, they have to confess. God finds them. As we know in verses 8 through 13, God finds them, he confronts them, and then everyone starts the blame game. "Oh, well, I ate because she told me to." And then, "Well, I ate because the snake told me to." So on and on it goes. There's blame going around. No one wants to take ownership of what happened. And then Lord judges sin. Look at verse 14. The Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all the beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. To the woman, so now he's turning to Eve, he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband. He shall rule over you. And to Adam, so now he's turning to Adam, and he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. And you shall eat of the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So we have a lot of judgment being laid down because of sin. It involves pain, it involves conflict, it involves misery, it involves hardship. Again, you notice what is being judged for Adam. The very thing that he was commissioned to do, which was to tend and keep the garden, is now also cursed. The very thing that he was sort of given by God to do, or ordained by God to do, is now going to be toilsome, laborsome. It's going to involve the thing that was supposed to bring him fulfillment is now bringing him frustration. And again, all of these curses can be all of this judgment can sort of be summed up, I think, but just by this separation. Adam and Eve chose, when they chose to distrust in God's word, and instead believing in the serpent's word, they chose to separate themselves again from their God-given identity. And this ultimately leads to actual separation. Genesis 3:24, at the very end of that chapter, he drove out the man. And at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed a cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. The ultimate grief, yes, is knowing the consequences of their choice, knowing now that death has entered the world, that now death is going to come upon each of them, but also now this most critical consequence of this chapter that we've been looking at is the fact that now the way human beings relate to God is fundamentally altered. Remember, we looked at this, Genesis 3, verse 8, and this is God sort of finding Adam and Eve after they sinned, but we sort of inferred that this was a natural occurrence. There was this beautiful, unhindered, sort of unashamed fellowship between God and man. That he would walk with them, he would commune with them, he would fellowship with Adam and Eve, and that they would be together in this beautiful, perfect fellowship and harmony. All of that is now broken. All of that is now changed. Man, God in his holiness, he cannot even entertain this unholy people now. So he drives them out. And now, if you don't have to go there, but you can turn there. This is what makes Genesis chapter 4 so pivotal. Because what are Cain and Abel doing at the beginning of chapter 4? They are communing with their Lord, and yet notice how they have to do it. Not like their parents did it. Now it has to be communing with sacrifice. Abel is bringing a sacrifice in order to, again, be an appeasing sacrifice to sort of break down those walls of separation and commune with their Creator. Again, this is sort of the basis for the rest of the history of humanity, is the fact that we need an atoning sacrifice in order to now reclaim that fellowship that we once enjoyed, that we were made for. Again, we were image bearers. The image is broken. We need someone to repair it. That's what's occurring here in this little moment. And all of this will help us understand salvation, which we're going to consider. But I think all of this sort of by way of introduction and review, helps us to consider this. Remember, we had two big questions regarding the doctrine of sin. The first one was, where does sin come from? Well, sin comes into the world, as we just looked at, Genesis 3. But the other big question I want to get to this morning is, how is sin passed down? Adam and Eve sinned, but how is sin passed down to us? This again relates to that question of souls that we've been sort of having the background of our conversations for a couple weeks. This relates to that. This relates to the doctrine of original sin. Are we coming into this world as innocent little infants and then we choose to sin later on? All of this is very important for us to consider. So how is sin passed down? This is what we're going to talk about. How is sin transferred from one generation to another? That we could call this the transference of sin, if you will. I think the key text is, of course, Romans 5:12. So again, if you want to turn there, you can. I have it on the screen, but we'll read it together. Romans 5:12 is perhaps the most important verse for this concept, and Paul says this in the middle of this really important section of Romans. All of Romans is really important, but he says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all sinned. And here, Paul very succinctly covers pretty much everything we've been talking about so far. And I think how you interpret this verse will really affect how you view sin and also likewise salvation. If you want to talk about origins, notice Paul mentions sin's origin. Sin came into the world through one man's decision. Again, that's what he's talking about. That's what he's referring to here. If you read the rest of Romans 5, he's really comparing Adam and Christ. And here he's saying through Adam's choice, sin came into the world. So here he puts all of the weight of rebellion on Adam's shoulders, and we can talk about that at a later date. But then he also mentions sin's judgment, because now we have to understand that the judgment of sin is death, ultimate separation. Separation from God. So we have the origins of sin. In a succinct way, we have the judgment of sin coming through death. And now, and also then at the end, we have the transference of sin because it's spread to all. And one succinct sentence, Paul covers everything that we've been talking about for 5 weeks up to this point. Paul is just a master at words. But I think, again, the really key word here is that word spread. So what does this word mean? Because this is really important for us to consider. It comes from the Greek word diarkomai, which means to pass along or to extend to. So he is essentially, again, saying that sin has extended to all men because of Adam. Through Adam. Through Adam, sin and death have been passed along. And he makes the same point in other places, not just Romans 5. He says the same thing in 1 Corinthians 15. Notice he says, for as by a man, again, Adam, came death, but as a man has come also the resurrection of the dead. Again, he's comparing Christ and Adam. And then at the end, for as in Adam all die, so in Christ all shall be made alive. So we have once again here this moment of realization that Adam's sin has spread to us. How so? That slide shouldn't have been there. We have 4 views here of transference. 4 views of looking at the way sin has been passed down. So we're going to go through them, and then if we have time, we'll kind of discuss them if you want to. The first view, the Pelagian view. So we have to start here. The Pelagian view, number 1. Pelagian view comes from a guy named, you might have guessed it, Pelagius. He was a British monk who lived in roughly the 3rd and the 4th centuries, and he was very, very well known in those days, and he was very insistent that everyone was born innocent. Remember that State of Theology survey that we referenced we referenced that last week, and I think, what was the stat? It was 61% of United States evangelicals would agree with Pelagius that everyone is born innocent, which should be concerning, as we'll see in a minute. Essentially, what Pelagius was arguing for, that since God was the creator of mankind's souls, there's that question, that conversation again, every soul has to be unstained by sin from the very start. And yet, when man chooses to sin, what is happening is he's following in the sin of Adam, which doesn't really do anything except make Adam little more than a bad example. Sin is following the bad example set down by Adam. And we become sinners when we follow the pitiful example of Adam, when we follow in his behavior. And again, Pelagius said, he argued that Adam wouldn't have died if he had not sinned. That was one of the tenets of his insistence here by this view. He said Adam would not have died, I'm sorry, let me back up. Forget what I just said in that second. Pelagius said that Adam would have died even if he hadn't sinned. That's what he was trying to argue for. Is that death wasn't a consequence of sin. Death was just a part of creation. And he would have died no matter what. Which, of course, you can go to Romans 6, you can go to Ezekiel, and several places in the Bible where it links specifically sin and death. Death comes in because of sin. But also, if we understand Pelagius' view, if everyone is born innocent, then we also have to understand that everyone has their own quote-unquote individual fall. And then the point of Pelagianism, if you will, is just to say that the gospel, the good news, doesn't become truly saving work. It becomes really just behavior modification. Because if you're just trying to fight a bad example, what do you need? You just need good examples to follow. And therefore, it's within your own ability, it's within your own willpower, even, to choose the good example. That's what Pelagius was arguing for. And of course, this doesn't track with the scriptures. And in fact, Pelagius was condemned as a heretic, by the way, in the 400s. So with U.S. evangelicals agreeing with Pelagianism, they're agreeing with heresy, by the way. So we can just call it what it is. The second view is Arminian view. The second view of sin's transference. So we have Pelagius, sin just comes down through a bad example. We have the second view, is the Arminian view, which, as you might have guessed it, comes from a guy named Jacobus Arminius. He was a Dutch theologian that lived in the 1500s. And of course, he had a lot of conflict with Calvin. You can get into all that kind of stuff if you want to go down some rabbit trails of church history. But essentially, what he argued for was something similar in terms of, he liked Pelagius' stuff. And so if we had to summarize the Arminian view, we call it semi-Pelagianism. And because he still argues for the fact that mankind chooses to sin. So mankind is still born innocent. Mankind chooses to sin. But once mankind chooses to sin, that's when God passes along all of Adam's guilt. So it's almost like all of the guilt of Adam is imputed to those who choose to sin. So he's trying to have his cake and eat it too, essentially. He's trying to argue for man's innocence, but also say that all of the weight of the judgment of sin on Adam is now on us because we made the same choice. So all of that this is where it's different than Pelagius. Pelagius didn't argue for all of this guilt being transferred to us. There really was no connection between Adam's sin and our sin with Pelagius. But here, Arminius is trying to argue for the same thing. And the implication then is that mankind, again, Arminius is trying to argue for this, and then we can understand that mankind's hope is what? Just make better choices. Don't choose those things. Again, that really nullifies what the gospel is about. The third view is called the federal view. The federal view comes from, I'm going to mispronounce this guy's name, Johannes Coxius. He is another Dutch guy, but he's living in the 1600s. And this is I won't say it really was like, it was proposed by him, I guess we could say organized by him. It became a really, really popular view of all of Reformed theologians. And essentially what this view does is it interprets Romans 5:12 as if Adam is mankind's representative, or we could say federal head. So just as we could say that he is sort of our stand-in. So Adam in the Garden of Eden is not just a historical person. He is, but he's also like a typical representative. He sort of stands in for us, for the rest of humanity. So Adam's choice to sin is our choice by proxy because he represents us. And this became a very, very popular view throughout all of church history. And I think there's a lot of biblical basis for this. I think there's a lot that you could argue for with this view. And I would not oppose anyone that clings to the idea that we are sinners because of our representative, that we are sinners also because Adam is our representative in the garden. The fourth view, really quick, and then I'll pause for questions or discussion really quick. But the fourth view is the Augustinian view, which, of course, as you might imagine, was developed by Augustine. Augustine, by the way, was sort of the opponent of Pelagius in the 3rd and 4th century, so they had a lot of times where they went toe-to-toe. Augustine, of course, you might know him as St. Augustine of Hippo. He was a bishop in North Africa, a very, very popular defender of Scripture and doctrine and orthodoxy. What he argued for is that humanity was a participant in Adam's sin, because as it says in Scripture, as the Scriptures we read, that we were, quote, in Adam. And how is that possible? How are we in Adam? Well, I want to go to another place. So just pause thinking about the doctrine of sin and go to Hebrews chapter 7 really quick. This is kind of where he formulates his view. And by the way, not to bury the lead, I think there's a lot of credence to what Augustine was saying here with this particular view. So look at Hebrews chapter 7, look at verse 9. Just so you remember, if you remember what the writer of Hebrews is talking about here in this particular section, he's laying the foundation. Again, Hebrews is an anonymous book. It's essentially a sermon. It's a 12 or 13-part sermon where, and essentially, he's trying to prove to you that Jesus is better. Jesus is better than this. Jesus is better than that. He's better than the priesthood. He's better than Moses. He's better than Joshua. He's better than the angels. On and on he goes. Here he's establishing the fact that Jesus has a better priesthood. And in so doing, he refers to that priest, Melchizedek, who is this very obscure figure that only appears in a couple of references, mainly Genesis chapter 14. And he's trying to show that even Abraham and all of his lineage then was deferring, showed deference, showed honor, and paid homage to Melchizedek. They acknowledged him as superior. And he's arguing for the fact that when Abraham did this, so did all of Abraham's descendants. Even Levi, who is the one through whom the priesthood comes. So look at what he says in Hebrews chapter 7, look at verse number 9, where the writer, let's back up to verse 6. He says, but this man, so he's talking about Melchizedek, who does not have his descent from them, received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. So that's a direct referral or reference to Genesis 14, by the way. And then he says, it is beyond dispute that the inferior blessed the superior. In the one case, so there's blessings happening and everyone is acknowledging that Melchizedek is this superior priest. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in another case, by the one whom it is testified that he lives. Notice what he says here, verse 9. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. So notice what he's saying. He's arguing for the superiority of Melchizedek's priesthood. How? By the fact that Abraham is paying tithes through him. And then he's also saying that it wasn't just Abraham, but all of Abraham's descendants too. Even Levi did. Because Levi was, quote, in Abraham. Oh, I forgot I had this on here. There we go. For he was still in the loins of his ancestor Abraham. So when Levi's great-grandfather paid homage to Melchizedek, Augustine was using this as rationale to say that so did, the Hebrew writer was saying this, that so did Levi, and the same argument is being made for humanity. He's using the same rationale to say that just as when Adam sinned, we were, quote, in Adam, therefore we sinned too. We were a participant in the sin of the garden, and this is how that verse is applied when it says that all men are now under the curse of death because, quote, all men sinned. And I think, by the way, again, I think that this is I think one of the better interpretations of Romans 5, if you ask me which view I would subscribe to, I would probably fall within the Augustinian view. I can definitely agree with you if you want to interpret Romans 5 through the federal view that Adam is just our representative. I don't think there's any biblical basis for the Arminian or the Pelagian view. Does anyone have any questions or comments before we proceed and kind of close out some of these themes? Or maybe that was just like too much stuff. Yeah, Greg.
Just to be clear, that the term born with a sin nature would be the same as conceived with sin nature?
Yes, correct.
Because, obviously you just preached about Jacob and Esau.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, don't think of just what they're saying conceived in it, they're saying born innocent, but also conceived innocent, those other views or whatever, basically they're saying that mankind is entering into this world either in their mom's womb or when they enter the world even after that, they're innocent. And we would argue against that. I would hope that, at least that's what I'm trying to argue for, is essentially that from conception, man is a sinner, not somewhere down the line. Doesn't matter how far you want to put that down the line, it doesn't really matter that window. But what I think is clear from the scriptures is the fact that mankind is conceived in sin, is conceived as a sinner. That there is no juncture, there is no point at which man goes from not being a sinner to being a sinner, either through anything, either just feeling the weight of something or his own decision. Mankind is a sinner because I would again argue, just as Augustinian argued, that we were, quote, in Adam. And then, because I think this is a helpful way to think about this, is when we get to here. And I think this is what enhances this verse, where it says that when Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness and image. Because now what? The image is broken. The image that was put into him by God when he formed him out of the dust of the ground and he breathed into his nostrils and he became a living soul. Yes, all of that is still true. He still bears the image of God, but the image of God, the imago Dei, is fractured. It's cracked. It's dented because of sin. And now everyone after him that is being fathered by him is bearing that same broken image. So everyone that is coming into this world is conceived in sin. As I think Summer brought this up last week, Psalm 51:5, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." David talking. David confessing. He's confessing the fact that this has been true since he was conceived. And I think this helps us understand our own sin nature, because I think very clearly, contrary to the popular opinion that we come into this world innocent, I think the Bible affirms just the opposite. This, of course, we could say it like this, that we aren't sinners because we sin. So we don't become sinners once we choose to sin. No, we are sinners we are sinners, therefore we sin. It's in our nature, it's in our DNA. It's in us to choose opposite of what God would have us to choose. This is the concept of original sin, which says that from basically the moment of conception onward, man is a sinner. We enter into this life with a sinful nature, and this curse of death on us. This comes from that really familiar phrase. Maybe, I don't know who in the world said this, but it's been attributed to like everyone under the sun. But the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. That's getting to the nature of the issue of the doctrine of sin. We can think about it in Genesis 6:5, where God saw that the wickedness of man was great, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. It's coming from out of him. All the generations of humans that have been born, again, to quote Genesis 5, in the image of Adam, are now just abounding in sin. Or as it says in Jeremiah 17, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can know it? And again, this comes from also not just the Old Testament, but the New Testament, as Jesus makes that statement in Mark 7. We won't go there for sake of time, but just this is where he makes that argument again. I think we mentioned it briefly last time, where he talks about how all of the things that the Pharisees were looking to clean up, he's basically saying you're cleaning the outside. The problem is the inside. Sin comes from within, he says. All of the evils, all of the atrocities, all of the wickedness that we see in this life, it's not just because of an environment or whatever. It comes from within mankind's heart and soul. Sin comes from within. So all of what that means then, all of this sets us up to understand the doctrine of salvation, which we're going to get to next week, because in and of ourselves, we can't just make better choices to make things better, to make ourselves better. We cannot and will not make the right choice. Romans 3 talks about this, that mankind doesn't seek after God, doesn't know God, doesn't want God. It's because it's in our nature to sin, permeates our entire being. So therefore, what we can understand that is that when the gospel comes, it comes as an announcement of a deeper fix. It doesn't just fix our behavior. It doesn't address the problem of making right choices. It addresses the heart of our problem. That's why it's called, that's why Jesus terms it when he's talking to Nicodemus as what? New birth. He doesn't just need more wisdom from some ancient rabbi on how to make better life choices because he can so he can resist the lure of sin. No, he needs to be remade. He needs to be reborn. He needs a new heart, which is exactly what Jesus offers in the gospel. Yeah, it's a spiritual concept that's being applied to a physical reality, but he's saying that this is what happens when you trust and believe in Jesus. You are reborn, you are remade, and it's as a sign of, you believe that by faith, and that at the end of all things, you're going to be remade, given a new body, one that's glorified. All of that is being sort of encapsulated in the doctrine of salvation, where it addresses our true problem. So again, this is an overview again of hamartiology, the doctrine of sin, that sets us up for soteriology, the doctrine of salvation. And I think again, it's important for us to keep in mind that what the gospel addresses is that deep issue, not just outward issues. Does anyone have any comments or thoughts about the doctrine of sin as we've covered it the last several weeks, or just anything that we've covered here this morning? Yeah, Natalie.
That's why Jesus has pure, holy blood. And that's why he was the ultimate sacrifice. Because our blood is tainted with sin.
Yes.
And so I was just thinking, like, at conception, that's when we sin.
Yes, exactly. And that's why, again, I think Pastor Eric sort of made this point the last week or maybe the week before about the fact that this is what enhances and sort of intensifies the virgin birth, and the fact that there is that the reason why that's so important, because there is not this mixture of sin nature or anything like that. He is sinless, and he is sinless because he is God come down in the flesh. Anyone have another thought? Eric does.
Yeah. So Psalm 51 we mentioned earlier, and that's a really good psalm to sum up everything, because we use verse 5. But behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and sin did my mother conceive me. And then the most famous verse of Psalm 51 is actually 5 verses later, which is verse 10, where it says, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." So in that same psalm, David's basically saying, I'm sin, I'm born in sin. It's a heart problem, so I need a new heart. Create in me a clean heart. And it's really cool when you tie it together. It pretty much summarizes this whole thing right here, just in that one psalm.
Yeah, that's a great, we should have included that, because that really addresses the whole thing that we're getting at, where the promise of God's mercy, the promise of the gospel, addresses everything: heart, body, mind, and soul. And it is going to, that's what the promise of that good news is remaking all of that, repairing all of that, repairing and restoring the image that's broken by sin and our choice to continue to sin. So That's what we're setting up to talk about next week. So come back next week where we'll finish out this subsection on man, sin, and salvation. We'll give, again, a bird's eye view of what it means to understand the doctrine of salvation. And we'll get as deep as we can, and then we'll see where we go from there. But thank you so much for this morning. Let me pray and we'll be dismissed.